exactly what he was doing at the time, but he was hit by a falling tree limb during a windstorm and was killed on impact. This meant that Derek had lost his mother, father, and brother over the course of a little more than 2 years, and what happened to Brian that night is still a mystery. It didn't take more than one look at Tom Messick to know that he had lived some life in his 82 years on Earth. He wasn't particularly imposing at 5'10", 160 pounds, but the signs were there nonetheless. In his 20s, Tom was a member of the prestigious and storied 82nd Airborne Division in the United States Army, serving as a paratrooper. During his service, Tom lost an eye and half his hearing in an explosion that also managed to mangle one of his hands so badly that it needed 159 stitches. This should have killed him, and the accident would have been life's defining moment for many, but not for Tom. His life was all about survival, and this was just another event he managed to live through. Later, he became an avid hunter and outdoorsman and loved it so much that he taught hunting and survival classes in and around his hometown in Troy, New York, about 160 miles north of New York City. Not even his age was enough to keep Tom out of the woods, especially when it came to an annual hunting trip he took with his friends and family. In 2015, though, Tom was just getting over a bad case of shingles with that year's trip quickly approaching. He was still dealing with some of the lingering effects, and he had to consider the possibility of staying home that year. When the time came, however, Tom decided that he was well enough to go. After all, he didn't know how many more he'd have a chance to attend at his age. And as tough as he was, the age was finally catching up to him. His later years had brought about some heart problems, and he didn't get around as well as he used to, so hunting for him had to be a bit modified. Either way, on November 15th, Tom joined 6 other friends and family members for a hunt on Lily Pond near Brant Lake, about an hour's drive north of his home in Troy. And Tom was excited for the trip. Even though he had been hunting with some members of the group for 55 years, none of them had ever been in that era, which was surprising considering how popular it was for fishing and hunting. At around 10 a.m., Tom and several of the older members in the group were put in position by the younger men with them. A couple of them were placed on watch just off a logging route, and Tom was assisted to an old tree stump to sit. Because he couldn't go after deer himself, the others would go to the other side of the lake and drive them right to him so he could take a shot. When Tom was settled, the younger men walked off to start spooking deer toward his location, but they returned to the tree stump without finding any. By the time they got back, about an hour had passed, and somewhere within that time, Tom disappeared. The group initially thought he might have gone to relieve himself, but shouting his name received no response. Because he was deaf in one ear, it was possible that Tom just didn't hear him, but his limited mobility meant that he should have been within the range of his hearing. For hours afterward, the rest of his hunting group searched, and then when 4:30 came without finding any sign of him, the group called the police and reported him missing. At that point, half of them returned to the cabin, and the other half remained behind, shooting their rifles and honking the car horn in hopes of helping Tom find them. Around midnight, the search was suspended, and a renewed effort would begin the next morning, involving 13 different search and rescue agencies. The search for Tom would be one of the most extensive in the history of the Adirondack Mountains. Locals even thought initially that a celebrity had gone missing because of all the activity in the area, and search and rescue teams would go on to use helicopters equipped with heat-detecting cameras, dogs, and an extensive grid system that should have easily found him, but that just didn't happen. Part of this was due to the conditions at Brant Lake in November that made the search challenging. By mid-November, the forest floor was coated in about 8 inches of leaves that had recently fallen. If it was summertime, there was a good chance Tom would have left behind footprints, but the thickness of the leaves made that impossible. Creating further problems was the heavy rain that moved into the area and remained for several days. This was where the methodical planning was supposed to give searchers the advantage. In 2008, a book was published called Lost Person Behavior, a search and rescue guide on where to look for land, air, and water. This book was written by a behaviorist named Robert Coaster, and as a rescuer, he has a 96% success rate in finding people missing in the outdoors. His book was the beginning of a whole new way of planning searches based on scientific studies, and one of the most important factors those studies identified is timing. The first 24 hours are crucial as the likelihood of finding a missing person alive starts to plummet as early as the second day of a search, especially when it involves someone of Tom's age. Another thing the book does is lay out the types of decisions lost people tend to make, emphasizing that missing people don't always think rationally, especially missing people who are being controlled by the anxiety that comes with being lost. In planning the search for Tom, team leaders also used mathematical probability models and something called Bayesian search theory. This essentially quantifies variables and calculates the probability of different events. This can include anything from past relevant results to personal gut feelings, and the probabilities change as new data comes in. Using this method, search and rescue teams can create fine-tuned probability maps that indicate where the highest likelihood of finding a missing person or object lies. High-profile cases in which it's already been used include the search for the USS Scorpion, which was a US Navy submarine that sank in 1968, and the disappearance of Malaysian Airlines Flight 370. However, the search dragged on despite the methodical approach and was conducted daily all the way until January 2016. By that point, experienced search and rescue team members were beyond baffled. Not a single shred of evidence connected to Tom has ever been found. In the meantime, several state and federal agencies, including the FBI, worked together to determine if there was any foul play involved in Tom's disappearance. Initially, investigators didn't see any reason to believe that Tom's disappearance was the result of abduction or murder, but the interview Tom's wife Beverly did with the FBI said otherwise. Beverly answered all their questions to the best of her ability, but few of hers received answers. The one thing the FBI did tell her, however, was they believed something wasn't quite right with the case. They just didn't know what it was. It's also worth noting that Beverly didn't think Tom got lost. The Tom she knew was an outdoor survival expert even at his age. She believed someone on an ATV encountered Tom and either frightened him off the tree stump, causing him to run off, or abducted him. Other family members believed that Tom probably wandered off and got lost, or he had a medical emergency. In the area of his disappearance, there were also caves, crevices, and the remnants of old abandoned mines that could have easily swallowed Tom up too. As with many of these disappearances, people always put forward the potential of alien abduction. One of his hunting friends was even interviewed and said that on the day Tom vanished, he heard a noise about 150 yards uphill from him near Tom's location. This noise was apparently unlike anything he'd ever heard before, to the point where he couldn't even describe it. There are also some other strange circumstances, although it's always hard to tell if these are revisionist versions of the events by the people involved. Apparently, the biggest thing that stood out to the group was that the woods were completely devoid of wildlife. Not only did they not see a single animal that day, they didn't hear one either. It was apparently abnormally quiet, and several in the group even told police that it was like something was keeping the animals away. Whatever the case, as of 2024, the search for Tom is ongoing, only on a much more limited basis, and not a single trace of him has ever been discovered. March 26, 1991 was a historic day for South Korea. It had been 30 years since the last local elections had taken place, but they had been reinstated, giving cities and towns a level of autonomy that had been missing. It was a renewed opportunity for South Koreans to have a say in their communities by electing council members, mayors, and other positions after living under military rule for several decades. The day was even marked as a national holiday, giving everyone the opportunity to exercise their right to vote. Understandably, the media coverage of the elections was extensive to witness the country's slow return to democracy. However, while much of South Korea was focused on the many elected positions up for grabs, it couldn't have been further from the minds of 5 boys between the ages of 9 and 13 living in a village outside the city of Daegu. The boys had plans of their own for their rare Tuesday with no school, and like many kids their age, they were fascinated with wildlife, so they were going out to look for frogs and salamanders. At around 9 o'clock that morning, Jong-woo's front door flew open, and his son, Cheo-woon, hurried in, checked through the closet, and grabbed a coat. The one he'd initially worn wasn't warm enough for the near-freezing temperatures that day, so he stopped back home for a thicker one. As he turned to rush back out, Jong-woo asked his son where he was going, but the only reply he received was the sound of the door shutting. Whether he was too excited about frog catching to hear his father, or he knew that answering honestly ran the possibility of sabotaging his plans for the day, Cheo-won hurried back to catch up with his friends. He was the oldest of the group of 5, and at 13 years old was seen as the leader of the group, so without him the plans might have been ruined if his father didn't let him go. Had he answered his father though, it may have averted one of South Korea's most shocking and enduring mysteries. Several hours later, at around 1 that afternoon, Jong-woo's phone rang. On the other line was Cheo-won's instructor from the Taekwondo academy he attended. Apparently, he hadn't shown up for a scheduled class. This immediately raised an alarm for Jong-woo. He knew his son as a responsible young man, and he never would have skipped his lesson for whatever he was up to earlier that day. Thankfully, all 5 of the boys were closer than brothers, and they had all grown up together despite their different ages. And in their village, the houses the boys lived in formed almost a circle around a field. So Jong-woo then grabbed his coat and began going door to door to each of the boys' houses. But then he grew even more concerned when he realized none of the parents knew where they went either. He also learned that each of the boys had been somewhat secretive about their plans for the day, meaning that not only were they missing, but they had no idea where they'd gone. Undeterred by this, the parents knew one of their favorite spots to hang out was Mount Warryong, so that's where the search started. While making their way up a mountain path, Jong-woo ran into a friend who said he saw the boys earlier and inquired about what they were up to. For him, the boys actually answered the question and told him about the frogs and salamanders, and based on the direction they were heading at the time, the mountain seemed to be the right place to start looking. A little while later though, and after searching around their usual spots, when they were unable to locate their sons, the parents were worried enough to call the police to report them missing. However, the response they received was sort of unusual. The police seemed to immediately write the boys off as some runaways who would turn up eventually if the parents were just patient enough. This dismissiveness only increased the tension the families were feeling, and they began pointing fingers at one another for not keeping a close enough eye on the boys. Then, as the afternoon turned to evening, reporters caught wind of the missing boys, but most outlets couldn't be bothered to cover the story with the landmark elections that day. The parents tried to appeal to newspapers and TV stations, but they received the same response they got from the police, to just wait and they would eventually turn up. Several days went by without a word of the boys' disappearance being uttered to the public, but then by the 1-week mark after the election coverage had dissipated, it turned into nationwide news. The public was quickly glued to the story, and the media continued following it. A popular news program called the Square of Public Opinion even reached out to the parents and asked if they'd come on as guests. By that point, the police were still dragging their feet on the investigation and weren't taking the disappearance seriously, and the parents made sure to make this extremely clear as they did interviews. Then, unexpectedly, while taking phone calls from the viewing audience, a sobbing voice came over the live broadcast. The audience in the studio and at home were stunned, and before anyone could respond to it, the call cut off. A telephone operator then came on the line and claimed that it was one of the 9-year-olds who had gone missing, and he was begging for his mother, which caused the studio audience to erupt in cheers. To them, this was proof that the boys were still alive, and if they were still alive, there was reason to have hope. But then, sadly, shortly afterward, the call was determined to be a prank, and the search was back to square one. This appearance wasn't for nothing, though. The show also caught the attention of the South Korean president, who then made a statement after it aired. He announced that he was devoting 300,000 police officers to a nationwide search, as well as opening a special investigation headquarters. Afterwards, searches were conducted in waterways, reservoirs, and even bus stations all over the country. A reward equivalent to $35,000 was offered for any information that led to finding the boys, and over the course of an entire year, thousands of volunteers were involved in more than 500 organized searches of Mount Warryong. Unfortunately, though, not one of these efforts went anywhere. During that span, all 5 of the boys' fathers quit their jobs to search for their sons. They then pooled their money together and rented a small truck, which they fitted with large signs meant to garner attention on the images of the 5 boys. Together, they drove from villages to towns to cities all over South Korea, handing out flyers and trying to uncover that one tip that would lead to the boys. This long, arduous tour ended up being fruitless, and every day that passed without some kind of positive news wore on some of the fathers more than others. One of them would dream about his son so often that he became afraid to sleep and became addicted to sleeping pills as a result. Others turned to alcohol, and the truck tour around the country eventually put the men in so much debt that they had to abandon the daily searches and return to the workforce. 2 years after returning to work and 5 years after the disappearance of their sons, the fathers had all mostly gotten their lives back on track. They had little choice but to move on, but their sons were always on their minds. As this new normal was setting in, a criminal psychologist who had taken it upon himself to investigate the disappearance came forward with a troubling theory. He believed that the father of one of the boys was responsible for killing them all and then buried them in his basement. The number of criminal psychologists in South Korea at the time was minimal, and this particular one had studied in the US for a while, which gave him a lot of credibility in the public's eyes. So the accusation sparked police into action, and a search was conducted at the house, which included digging up the basement with an excavator. Media coverage was wall-to-wall of the search, and cameras were even allowed into the basement to capture the dig. When the entire basement was virtually destroyed, with no bodies being found though, the psychologist ran to the house and pushed his way through the crowd outside. Once they learned that his accusations were false, the angry mob chased after him. He even eventually had to be picked up by police and brought to the station for his own safety. And tragically, 5 years later, that same father died of liver cancer at the age of 49, which was a condition believed to be exacerbated by the stress of his son's disappearance and the psychologist's claims. Another year after that, and the story continued fading from the media spotlight. However, the remaining fathers continued to go to newspapers and TV stations in the country's capital, begging for any coverage of the case, only to be escorted out of each and every building. A year after the death of that one father, and 11 years following the boy's disappearance, 2 men were gathering acorns on Mount Warryong when one of them came across a tangle of skeletal remains sticking out of the ground. These bones belonged to the 5 boys, who would become known as the Frog Boys afterward. Police then came to the scene immediately, and street officers with no experience or understanding of how to properly excavate a body began digging the bones out. This was already bad enough for the integrity of the evidence, but instead of keeping the bones of each body together, they sorted them according to likeness, putting skulls with skulls, femurs with femurs, vertebrae with vertebrae, and so on. So by the time forensic scientists arrived 2 hours after the call came in, the police had completely mixed up the bodies, with no way of telling which bones belonged to which boys. Either way, the next day police held a press conference and announced that the likely cause of death was hypothermia. The day the boys went missing was already cold and wet, and that night more rain came in as temperature dipped to 3 degrees Celsius or about 37 degrees Fahrenheit. These conditions would have almost certainly caused hypothermia, and initially the bunched up bodies and the clothing of one of the boys that had been tied together were seen as proof that they huddled together for warmth. When the clothes were untied though, both live bullets and empty cartridges came pouring out of the bundle, and a further examination of the skulls was even more troubling. 3 of the 5 had signs of blunt force trauma, likely caused by some kind of metal instrument or tool, suggesting foul play. This was then only underscored by the fact that the bodies were found less than 2 kilometers from their homes in an area they knew well. As many had already suspected, the chances of them getting lost and dying of hypothermia were seeming very unlikely. In the wake of this discovery, theories and rumors went wild, and police put forward the possibility of a pattern killer, but no similar crime scenes were found before or after the boys went missing. What is seen as the strongest theory of all points to something at the top of Mount Wariyang. In addition to a pond near the summit, there was a South Korean army base where an infantry division was stationed. As part of the base, there was a shooting range. Because of the national holiday for elections, there were no drills conducted that day, but commissioned officers were allowed to shoot at any time they pleased. The boys were found only 100 to 200 meters downrange, well within the capabilities of the rifles used there. There are reports that one officer did visit the range that day to shoot off some extra bullets he had, but it was never determined who exactly that was. At least one set of parents believe that all the boys were killed to cover up one of them being shot accidentally, but that's never been confirmed. It was confirmed, however, that the bullets found among the boys' clothing were unquestionably from the army base, but an investigation of the military base and its occupants was never conducted by police or the government. In the years that followed, the parents collectively sued police 3 times for negligence in their investigation, but they lost all 3 lawsuits. As for the boys, after being stored at a lab for several years, their remains were returned to their parents for a proper burial. Because the bones were all mixed together, they were cremated together too, and just as in life, the Frog Boys are together in death, as the mystery of what happened to them remains. So, I'm curious to hear what you think happened in each of the stories, and you can let me know down in the comments. Also, hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 2 more creepy cases of people disappearing. The first one is just outright disturbing, and the second one is one of the most infamous cases in all of history. And to this day, both cases remain officially unsolved. As always, viewer discretion is advised. In the early afternoon of July 5th, 1996, just after the big lunch rush, the phone rang at the Eco Pizzeria on the south side of Chicago, as it typically did most of the day. After 2 o'clock though, things quieted down for a while before Eco entered dinner time. When the phone rang around this time of the afternoon, the owner, Everett Thompson, knew there would usually be a familiar voice on the other line to greet him. Sure enough, it was his father Herman. Herman knew that his son would likely have a moment to catch his breath in the afternoon, and that was the perfect time to pester him about visiting Philadelphia. Despite the distance between them, Everett was close with his parents. Years earlier, he left Philly to work in the steel mills in Chicago, and after meeting and marrying his wife Lydia, he left the steel mills and opened up the Eco Pizzeria. Although he had no previous restaurant experience, with Lydia's support, Everett knew he had to give it a shot. Cooking was his top passion, and he knew he was good enough to make a career out of it. By owning his own restaurant, he was living a life he only dreamed about, and he got to share it with the love of his life and their children, 11-year-old Everett Jr. and 8-year-old Andrew. The 2 boys were actually the reason for Herman's phone call. It had been too long since he had seen the grandkids, so a trip to Philadelphia was long overdue. At the same time, owning a restaurant was demanding work, so it wasn't easy to take time off. But, just like every other time Herman would call, Everett promised his father he'd bring them for a visit just as soon as he could. While the 2 talked on the phone, the other phone line started ringing, and Everett glanced at the caller ID and saw his home phone number on the display. He told Herman to hang on a second, and then switched over to the other line, and then he heard Lydia's voice, and she sounded frantic. The words she was saying were almost surreal, and Everett had to fight the urge to ask her to repeat them. Her brother Kenneth had an axe and was threatening to kill Lydia and the kids. Before Kenneth could get within swinging distance of the boys, Lydia grabbed them and took them to the bedroom, where she locked the door and called Everett. He then told her to stay where she was and not open the door under any circumstances. Then, switching back to the line with Herman, Everett told him that Lydia was in trouble and he had to go. He then turned to the restaurant manager and said the same, and around 3 o'clock, Everett hurried out the door and jumped into his van to race home. Surprisingly, this was like deja vu. Not 2 days earlier, Lydia called police for the exact same thing, and Everett had to leave the restaurant in a hurry then too. Her brother Kenneth, who was 41 years old at the time, was prone to angry outbursts and unhinged behavior, which had him in and out of prison most of his life for a variety of violent crimes. And ever since Kenneth had been released from prison the most recent time, he had been nothing but trouble for the family. Lydia also inherited the house they were living in on the south side of Chicago when her mother died. During that time, Kenneth was locked up, but the house was intended to be split 3 ways between Lydia, Kenneth, and one other sibling. With each of them owning a third of the house, Kenneth moved in when he was paroled, and there was nothing Lydia could do about it. A couple of hours later, at 5 o'clock, Everett's employees saw his van pull back in its designated parking spot, relieved that he had made it back just in time for things to get busy. They figured whatever was wrong earlier had been resolved, but when the driver's side door opened, it wasn't Everett who got out of the van. Instead, it was a tall, lanky man in his early 40s they immediately recognized as Kenneth. As he walked in, he was approached by the manager, and before the manager could say anything, his attention was drawn to shoes Kenneth was wearing. The shoes themselves were nice enough, but it wasn't the style that caught the manager's eye. It was how well these sterile white sneakers contrasted with the streaks of blood on them. When the manager shifted his focus away from the shoes, he asked Kenneth where Everett was, and according to Kenneth, Everett was in a car accident on the way to get Lydia and was arrested at the scene for reasons Kenneth struggled to specify. It was an odd interaction, but after grabbing a takeout order, Kenneth left the store and drove away in the van. As days passed, Everett failed to show up for work, and no one could get a hold of anyone in the family, and Herman was especially bothered by his inability to get in contact with Everett with his phone calls. Without fail, any other day, Herman would find him at the restaurant whenever he called, but employees told Everett's father they hadn't seen him since he rushed out the door on July 5th. After nearly 2 weeks without hearing from his son, Herman called the Chicago police and requested a welfare check on the Thompsons' home. When police officers arrived, it was Kenneth who answered the door. The officers explained the reason for their visit, and Kenneth was quick to explain it away. On a whim, Kenneth said, Everett decided to load up the family in the van and take an unplanned trip to Philadelphia. Police then asked if they could enter the home and take a look around to be sure, and Kenneth obliged, but a tour of each room revealed nothing out of the ordinary, so the officers thanked Kenneth and left the house. Surprisingly, despite Kenneth's claim that the Thompsons took the van to go to Philly, the van was parked at the house when police arrived, and they didn't even notice. Then, in the days after the Thompsons seemingly disappeared, police even pulled Kenneth over for a traffic violation while driving the family's van. Unfortunately, they never connected the dots between his original story and the record they had of Kenneth being in possession of the van. Before the month ended with no further word from the Thompsons, Everett's parents drove from Philadelphia to Chicago to find out what was going on for themselves. As they pulled into the area, they went straight to the Eat Co, where they expected Everett to be. They then parked and entered the restaurant, where they spoke to the manager and learned about Kenneth having the van and his bloody shoes. That was all Everett's parents needed to hear, and they went straight to the police and begged them to investigate. This time, when police started to investigate a little more closely, they quickly found that none of what they already knew made sense. This was when they realized the alarming oversight involving Kenneth's original story in the van, but there was nothing they could do about it by then because the van was gone. One of the first things they did was check police reports from July 5th to confirm that Everett was involved in an automobile accident and arrested as a result, but no record of that existed. Kenneth's phony story and the reported blood on his shoes were enough probable cause to secure a warrant, but when police showed up at the Thompsons' home to serve it, they could barely believe what they saw. The whole interior of the house had been completely gutted. The confused police were then approached by the equally confused new owners of the house who were having it remodeled. This meant that if there was any physical evidence that pointed to foul play in the disappearance of the Thompsons, it was now in a landfill somewhere. The next best thing police could do was review the report of the house inspection conducted before the sale. In it, the inspector noted that the kitchen floor had been ripped out with the subfloor exposed as if someone was preparing it for a new floor. This, by the way, was before the new owners came in and started tearing the place apart. There was also a mention of a toilet and bathtub that were painted red. However, the officers who responded to Lydia's 911 call 2 days prior were emphatic in their denial that any of the bathrooms had a red toilet or bathtub when they were there. If there had been, that would have stuck out beyond anything else they witnessed during their look-around. When police finally tracked down and arrested Kenneth and brought him in for questioning, they found out that the van was sold to a scrapyard and crushed immediately afterwards, so any evidence that might have been in there was long gone too. This also brought the next question of how Kenneth sold the van and the house, since they were both in Lydia's name, and the answer was simple. Kenneth forged her signature. This was already a for sure conviction, but police had two options: arrest him now and hope to secure a murder charge before he was released, or don't arrest him and see what he does next to turn up any leads. They opted for the latter and uncovered some of the strongest evidence in the case against Kenneth as a result. After he sold the house, Kenneth bought a trailer home in, of all places, Gary, Indiana, and a year after the Thompsons vanished, the FBI and police secured a warrant to search it. Investigators then searched the trailer and Kenneth's belongings, and they also brought in cadaver dogs to see if they could find something police officers couldn't. Among the items they uncovered in the trailer was a child's sock and a pair of shorts, both heavily stained with blood. Despite the find though, police weren't able to tie the items to the Thompsons. Afterward, more time would pass without answers, and Kenneth continued to garner the attention of police, both as a top suspect and a habitual offender. He was arrested November 1997 for a probation violation for failing to register as an offender, and in the following months he was charged with forgery after he was caught trying to cash another $13,000 check using Lydia's forged signature. When state prosecutors met up with the media, they brought up that Kenneth was the top suspect in the Thompson family disappearance, which was news that hadn't been released to the public yet. It seemed like things were heating up in the Thompson family saga, but just days later, none of it mattered. Kenneth was found dead on a late December morning. He was the only one in the cell, and it wasn't an accident. So, the valuable information of the whereabouts of the Thompsons died with him. Almost 30 years later, Everett Sr., Lydia, Everett Jr., and Andrew are still considered missing persons. Alcatraz is one of, if not the most famous prison on Earth. If you're from North America, I probably didn't even need to tell you it was a prison, but for those who aren't familiar, almost exactly 2 kilometers from shore, Alcatraz is a small, cold, lonely island in the San Francisco Bay. This little island would eventually go on to house one of the most isolated and supposedly inescapable prisons on Earth. The first permanent structure on the island was almost built under Mexican ownership in 1846 with the Mexican government intent on installing a lighthouse. Later on, as part of the new state of California and during the California Gold Rush, the US Army set about turning the island into a fortress. By 1861, the same year the American Civil War began, it also became a prison, an armory, and a training base. The harsh currents, cold water, and fortifications made it ideal for keeping prisoners in and everyone else out. Then, in 1868, the island would officially be designated a military prison as its main function. POWs from the Spanish-American War would follow in 1898 and more civilian prisoners in 1906, with the San Francisco earthquake compromising the structure or security of several mainland prisons. Between 1909 and 1912, the prison's main building would be constructed, and sometime between then and 1915 earned the island its common nickname, the Rock. In 1933, the island was officially transferred to the Bureau of Prisons, who designated it a federal prison in the next year. Its new purpose would be to house people too dangerous to hold elsewhere, and especially people with a history of escape attempts or violence during incarceration. Afterward, everyone from mob bosses, bank robbers, murderers, and famous and eccentric prisoners would pass through the island, but it would only actually serve as a civilian prison for just 29 years. And during that time, it would also be said that no one had ever escaped, but that depends a bit on how you define escape. During the prison's lifespan, 36 men made 14 different attempts to escape. A few lasted seconds, some made it multiple days, but there's one that stands far and above the rest. It's now known as the escape from Alcatraz, and it's maybe the most infamous prison escape in all of history. In December of 1961, 4 men, including Frank Morris, brothers John and Clarence Anglin, and Alan West, were housed in adjacent cells. They lived, worked, and dreamed together, looking out over the water in brief glimpses whenever a prison job brought them somewhere where they could see, because the cells didn't have any windows otherwise. The prison was also as fortified as the cells were isolated. Each cell was made of hardened, cut-resistant bars, there were guard patrols around the clock, and the island was surrounded by freezing water for kilometers on all sides. Even the shape of the prison, with tall retaining walls, guard towers, and choke points like stairwells, made it easier for guards to keep track of movement. Unfortunately, Frank was paying careful attention to all of this. Born in Washington, D.C. in 1926, Frank was a very intelligent man and probably wouldn't have found himself in Alcatraz if not for losing his parents at 11 years old. His life spiraled, first into theft, then drugs, armed robbery, and after an escape from prison in Louisiana, he found himself transferred to Alcatraz. Any escape attempt wasn't going to work out alone though. As smart as he may have been, Frank Morris was only one person, and the work that needed doing would have taken him years to do alone. This is where he got the help of John and Clarence Anglin. The brothers were 2 out of over a dozen siblings from Georgia, born a year apart in 1930 and 1931. Their parents were seasonal farmhands who moved up and down the eastern half of the United States to follow their work. But the brothers built a history of breaking into businesses after hours and one time robbed a bank with a toy gun. These would continue to escalate until they were finally arrested, and then once in the prison system, multiple attempts to escape the Atlanta Penitentiary got John transferred to Alcatraz in October 1960 and his brother Clarence the next year, January of 1961. But it was actually the 4th man, Alan West, who came up with the idea that set everything in motion. Alan was born in New York in 1929 and had been arrested over a dozen times before a car theft in 1955 sent him to the Atlanta Penitentiary and then to Florida State Prison. Trying to escape from the state prison eventually landed him on Alcatraz in 1957, several years before the other men. During his time at the prison, Alan occasionally found himself working up on the roof of the main building where he noticed the various drains and ventilation shafts, and it gave him an idea. One day, back in his cell, he told the brothers and Frank about it and how it might be just the opportunity they were looking for. The men knew quite a few people had tried to escape before them, and it all failed. Most had been captured, but some had